Inside the cockpit of this aircraft, a struggle is going on as the pilots are desperately trying to fight off a man who is trying to shut down the aircraft's engines.
What happened? He tried to shut the engines down.
But the story that has led up to this terrifying ordeal is far more complex than you might think and has ramifications that should ripple through the entire aviation industry.
I am not okay. I need to wake up.
Today I will tell you a story about a crime and a tragedy. And this story will point to a system that is broken and that will cause more tragedies unless it's fixed soon. A quick warning, this story will contain references to mental health issues, and I will link to some helpful resources here in the description below. It all happened on a cloudy afternoon on the 22nd of October 2023. At Everett Payne Field in Washington, United States, two pilots from Horizon Air were preparing for a flight which would bring them down towards San Francisco International Airport. Autumn had finally come, with the last few leaves still trying to hold on to the tree branches, but on this day the winds were calm, with the temperature hovering around 53 degrees Fahrenheit or 12 degrees Celsius. A really nice day to go flying. The two pilots were going through their cockpit preparations like on any other day, whilst their three cabin crew members were preparing the cabin, all of them completely unaware that this day would not turn out to be anywhere close to normal. In the terminal building, the passengers who were booked for the flight were getting ready to board the Embraer 175 that was waiting for them outside. This aircraft only had 76 seats, and on this day the aircraft was completely full, something that wasn't uncommon on this particular route. As the rest of the passengers were boarding, a 44-year-old man in a dark sweater and suit pants presented himself to the gate crew. He showed them his Alaska Airlines pilot badge and asked politely if he could get a jump seat down towards San Francisco. The badge showed that he was a Boeing 737 captain for Alaska Airlines, and since Horizon Air is a wholly owned subsidiary to Alaska Airlines, this type of request was completely routine. A large number of airline pilots in the United States are not based where they're living, meaning that the whole industry depends on the ability to hitch a ride cost-free to and from the pilot's home bases. Without that ability, the whole industry would grind to a screaming halt almost immediately. Now, these jump seat flights are not done like in the movie Catch Me If You Can anymore. There are strict FAA-established procedures for when and how a person is accepted on board, and these include applying through an online system known as the Cockpit Access Security System, or CAS, and then, of course, also asking the operating pilots for permission before boarding the flight. And this pilot was following all of these protocols. He was coming back from a meetup with a group of friends outside Seattle who had gotten together to commemorate his best friend who had died a few years earlier. It had been a really sad affair, which had affected him deeply, and now he just wanted to get home to his wife and children who were waiting for him. Before he boarded the flight, he sent a text message to his wife saying, "I just want to hold you." Now, since the flight was completely full, the only real place he could sit was either on the back jump seat with the flight attendants or in the cockpit, and as any pilot would, he chose to sit in the cockpit so he could chit-chat a little bit with his colleagues. There was a bit of a delay during the boarding, so the flight, which was scheduled to depart at 17:25 local time, didn't start pushing until about 5 minutes after schedule. Once the Embraer had started moving away from its stand, all of the pre-flight procedures ran really smoothly, and at time 17:43, the aircraft took off normally from runway 34 left and started a left turn down towards the south. Once the sterile phase of the flight was completed, the three pilots started comparing some differences between the aircraft types that they were flying, which is a very typical call talk between pilots. The aircraft was behaving normally and everything else was flowing just like on any other day. But what the two operating pilots didn't know was that a darkness was building up in the mind of their jump-seating colleague, a darkness that would soon show itself. The aircraft they were flying, the Embraer 175, is a fantastic little airliner with a very modern cockpit and onboard systems. It is powered by two General Electric CF34 turbofan engines, and some of those engines' internal systems, specifically the fire suppression system, is soon going to play an important role in this story. In most modern aircraft, there are several different fire detection and suppression systems on board, covering everything from lavatories and cargo holds to the engines and the auxiliary power unit. In the engines, the fire detection system consists of two independent fire detection loops, which monitors the temperature around some of the key components inside of the engine. If both of those loops senses a temperature high enough to trigger a fire warning, well then the fire alarm goes off in the cockpit. A fire warning symbol can be seen on the engine instruments as well as several other warning indications. Those includes the related fire extinguisher handle located in the overhead panel, which will illuminate red to show which engine is on fire. If this happens in flight, the pilots need to first expeditiously verify what is going on, which engine is involved, and then execute memory items, which are checklist items that has to be done by memory since they're time critical. The pilot flying will concentrate on continuing to fly the aircraft, and the pilot monitoring will start executing the memory items by first disengaging the auto throttle, verifying which engine is affected, and then move the thrust lever to idle. Selecting the start-stop selector to stop, and then pull the fire extinguisher handle. When that handle is pulled, it immediately closes the related fuel and hydraulic shutoff valves, isolating the engine from these systems, and it also closes the engine bleed air and cross-bleed shutoff valves. The whole idea with this first movement of the handle is to isolate the engine and to shut it down, hopefully then stopping the fire by doing so. The next step is then to turn the handle, and when that is done, this blows off a tiny explosive charge next to the fire extinguishing bottles, releasing the fire retardant into a pipe which leads to the affected engine. Once that is done, the engine will likely not be able to be restarted, which you obviously wouldn't really want it to be in case there is a fire in it. But the first step, when the handle is only pulled, that can be reversed by pushing the handle back in again, which will then reopen the affected valves. Now, in the Boeing 737 that I fly, since these handles have the ability to shut the engines down, they're locked by a solenoid when a fire is not detected. They can still be pulled up, and that can be done in case a QRH checklist, for example, asks for it, but that will require pushing an override button to release the handles from the lock. But curiously, that's not the case on the Embraer. Its handles can actually be pulled at any time, and that will soon become important. They were eventually cleared to climb to flight level 310, which was their planned cruise level, and once they leveled off, the pilots started completing their cruise procedures as the aircraft passed in over Oregon. These procedures would have included some paperwork and verification of fuel and pressurization levels, but generally it tends to be the most relaxed part of most flights. Up until this point, none of the pilots had noticed that their colleague on the jump seat had started to squirm around a bit in his seat and was starting to look more and more stressed and agitated. And then suddenly, about 10 minutes after the aircraft had reached its cruise level, he suddenly and without warning threw his headset forward into the cockpit and called out, "I'm not okay." Within seconds, he launched up from his seat, reaching for the two fire extinguisher handles that were placed right above where he was sitting. He put his hands on them and then pulled them out. Stop. Let's hold here for a moment and look at this really bizarre situation, because this doesn't seem to make any kind of sense, does it? Before I tell you what happened next, let's back the tape a bit and go back, way back in time, to see why this loving husband and father of two was now about to shut down the engines of an airliner at 31,000 feet, risking the lives of himself and everyone on board. The jump-seating pilot's name was Joe, and Joe knew already from the 5th grade that all he wanted to do was to become an airline pilot. He was absolutely fascinated with aviation and everything around it, so when his parents gave him a test lesson as a present, they really sealed the deal. This was what he was going to do with the rest of his life. Back then, he was also relentlessly teased in school by some of the kids, and to help him deal with that trauma, he got into contact with a therapist for the first time, which helped him tremendously. Just like most people who have been bitten by the aviation bug, Joe then spent most of his free time trying to come up with ways to earn money which he could spend towards flying lessons. He was really industrious and even put ads into the local newspaper, letting people know that he could come over and mow their lawns and do other type of chores just to earn money to pay for his training. In short, he did everything he could to reach his goal, and all of this sounds exactly like my own story and how I got into aviation. He eventually started his flight training when he was just 15, got his first license at 17, and after he had finished college, his dream came true when he landed his first commercial airline job flying for Horizon Air. He worked for them for a while and then changed over to Virgin America, and after they had been bought by Alaska Airlines, he eventually rose to the rank of captain and later even instructor, initially on the Airbus fleet. During this time, he also met his wife and started a family where he eventually became the father of 2, and he was universally seen both by his family and colleagues as a well-balanced, calm and level-headed person, someone you could trust and who wanted everyone well. His career was going great, and the fact that he had managed to become an instructor meant that he could stay more days at home with his family, which he felt was super important. Again, that sounds exactly like me. Everything was going fine for Joe, until in 2018, his best friend, who was also the best man at his wedding, suddenly died during a work trip to Hawaii. Joe helped bring his body back home, and this sudden shock of grief hit him really, really hard. So hard, in fact, that he decided to go back into therapy again. His therapist soon recognized that the problems Joe was now dealing with went beyond just normal grief and started to look more like the early onsets of clinical depression. This was likely something that he had been struggling with without really realizing it for a long time at that point. Depression, or major depressive disorder, is one of the most common mental health issues that we have, and it will affect between 5 and 17% of all people out there at some point during our lives. The therapist told Joe that she couldn't give him a formal diagnosis, but that she felt that he would do well in talking to a doctor who could give him that diagnosis and maybe even prescribe some antidepressant medication. But here we get to the problem. After he had heard this, Joe did some quick research which showed that any use of antidepressants would likely mean that he would temporarily lose his medical certificate and be grounded for an unknown period of time. Aviation authorities around the world, including the FAA, have for many decades before been using the better safe than sorry attitude when it comes to mental illness, and have put very stringent medical requirements in force to keep these types of issues out of the cockpit. This has meant that once diagnosed with a mental disorder, especially if there's medication involved, the road back to the cockpit have traditionally been very long and complicated, with several hoops that the pilots would have to jump through, including sometimes long waiting times for evaluations, on top of course, the already very heavy stigma that mental disorders carry. And even though this has likely improved during the last few years, with the FAA even approving some milder antidepressants for pilots back in 2010, the stigma is still very much real, and with this in mind, there is a strong tendency for pilots to avoid seeking help, even when it's obvious that they should. Now, I know that there are likely quite a few of you out there thinking, good, I don't want any depressed pilots flying my aircraft, and we need stricter rules. But whilst that is a very understandable first reaction, it is also an extremely dangerous one. Pilots are human beings, just like everybody else, and even though we have to go through stringent evaluations before we get our jobs, that doesn't mean that we are less susceptible to mental issues later on during our lives. A loss of a child or a spouse, extreme financial stresses, or indeed a constant work pressure and changes in sleep rhythms can all be triggers for depression. And even though it is not more common among pilots than other groups, I don't think that it's more rare either. So with that in mind, what do you think happens when a pilot starts feeling that help is probably needed, but at the same time, he or she also knows that seeking that help might mean a substantial loss of income or even permanent loss of license and career? Yeah, the problems might well be hidden, swept under the rug and possibly never properly dealt with. Or in the worst case scenario, the pilot might even start self-medicating to get some relief. And the stricter the rules become, the more these problems will be driven underground, meaning that more pilots with perfectly treatable initial issues might not get the help they need, leading to even worse future symptoms. So this really puts the focus on how the aviation authorities out there deal with this problem going forward. For this to get any better, they have to convince the pilots that they can and should seek help when needed, and that there is a true and believable way back to the cockpit if they do. Now, of course, there will be psychological problems that might be deemed so bad that they are completely incompatible with the pilot job, but they are in the vast minority here, and the only way to find those individuals is for pilots to trust the system enough to seek help in the first place. The first officer who flew Germanwings Flight 9525 straight into a mountain in France back in 2015 had been diagnosed with depression very early on in his career, and then he was allowed back with a clear restriction in his certificate saying if this depression ever comes back, he would permanently lose his medical license. If you get a restriction like that in your license, do you think that you would ever officially look for help again? Or do you think that you would try to hide it? Now, there's plenty more details in that story that I might cover in a separate video, but my message remains really clear. Stricter rules does not solve the core problem here. Destigmatizing mental health issues and creating well-working peer support programs, like American Airlines Project Wingman for example, must in my view be introduced in every airline. On top of that, working contracts must of course allow for pilots to recover properly while still receiving a living pay before they return to the cockpit, and that's sadly not always the case right now. Now, the rest of this story should serve as an example to why these points are so important. You see, Joe, after having been scared off by his research into what might happen if he were to use medication, decided not to go to a doctor, but instead to try more intense therapy. He also sometimes self-medicated with alcohol when he had a couple of days off, but never in connection with his flying duties. He was really careful with anything that had to do with his job, and he always followed all of the rules and regulations out there. His medical certificate was therefore kept valid throughout his difficulties, with no trace of any issues being noticed by either his friends nor his colleagues. His wife had at some point tried to get him to see a doctor to get some help after he had confided in her, but he had then explained that he didn't want to risk their livelihood and his dream by doing so. So instead, he just soldiered on, and during the year leading up to the incident, his workload kept steadily rising with the increase in passenger travel after the pandemic, plus the fact that he had to change over to the Boeing fleet, which meant a new typewriting course, who kept him away from his family for most of the summer. He was also appointed safety representative in the San Francisco base, with the role of trying to increase overall safety awareness among the crews, including to get them to file more safety reports. And then, in the end of October, he did the fateful trip together with a group of friends up to Washington State for a memorial get-together for his best friend, something that they had started doing the previous year and wanted to make into a tradition. During the Friday night, as the group of friends were sitting together and having a couple of drinks, someone in the group suggested that they should try psychedelic mushrooms. Joe was very hesitant since he knew the rules regarding drug use. He would normally even avoid second-hand marijuana smoke since it might show up in the random drug tests that airlines do, and he never used any medication at all if he could avoid it. But his friend convinced him that the mushrooms were completely safe and that they wouldn't appear in any type of drug tests. On top of that, he was not scheduled to fly for another 6 days, and the effect of the mushrooms should only last for a few hours, so this shouldn't be any kind of problem. With all of that in mind, and in his overall state of grief and sadness, he took the decision to try a bit of the mushrooms, which was of course a major lapse of judgment. Now, the active ingredients in psychedelic mushrooms, mainly psilocybin and psilocin, have lately showed a lot of promise in clinical trials for treatment of, among other things, depression. But during those same trials, some worrying signs have also started appearing. Those consist mainly in the fact that while very small controlled amounts of these substances might be helpful for some, they might also trigger full-blown psychotic episodes in people who have certain pre-existing psychological disorders. Now, I want to step in here and make it absolutely clear that any type of uncontrolled drug use outside the advice of a medical professional and the knowledge of your aeromedical examiner is completely incompatible with flying activities. It obviously doesn't matter at all if they will appear in a drug screening or not. Soon after Joe had tried the mushroom, he started feeling really uneasy. He felt that his friends were talking about him behind his back and that he was somehow in danger and couldn't trust them. He spent the whole night in that state of paranoia without being able to sleep at all, and he got more and more convinced that he was actually stuck in a bad dream that he couldn't wake up from. His mind kept playing up horrifying memories from his childhood, and he got an overwhelming feeling that his wife and children weren't safe and that he needed to get back to them. He later described that feeling as going through purgatory, a living hell. The Saturday passed without his condition improving, and he spent another agonizing night towards Sunday, again without being able to get any sleep. So this was the state that he found himself in when his friends drove him to the airport on the Sunday afternoon for his flight back to San Francisco. In the car ride, he couldn't make sense of the GPS or how the car was moving, and when he got to the airport, he felt that the gate personnel weren't following procedures and that the boarding of the passengers were all wrong and didn't make any kind of sense. Just like a fever nightmare. On the outside, he didn't show any of this, but on the inside he was screaming that he just wanted to wake up from this. When he finally boarded the aircraft and sat down in the cockpit, he talked to his colleagues, but still got that nagging feeling that something was very wrong. He felt that he had met one of the pilots before, but just could not know where he had done so, and he even started questioning if these two really were pilots at all. After takeoff, he found their reactions to the aircraft encountering some light turbulence perplexing, and his feeling of being in a nightmare just grew stronger and stronger until finally he decided to make himself wake up. And what is it that normally makes you wake up from a nightmare? When Joe had thrown his headset across the cockpit and started talking about not feeling well, it had obviously alerted the two pilots to the fact that something was very, very wrong. They now looked back just in time to see how Joe reached up for the fire extinguishing handles and pulled them both out. This immediately shut off the fuel and hydraulics to both engines, but luckily there was still enough fuel left in the lines to keep the engines running for a few seconds, so the engines didn't immediately flame out. Since we don't have the final report, we don't know if it was the captain or first officer who reacted first, but one of them immediately charged at Joe, grabbing his wrists while simultaneously pushing the two handles back in again. This restored the fuel flow to the engines. So that solved the immediate threat, but Joe, who was still determined to wake himself up from this escalating nightmare, continued to struggle for around 30 seconds to try and reach the handles again before he suddenly got temporarily pulled back into reality, stood up and then left the cockpit. The whole situation took around 90 seconds, and as soon as Joe had left, the pilots secured the flight deck door and then called in what had just happened to air traffic control. Whenever a hijacking attempt or really any disruptive passenger event happens which threatens the aircraft or someone on board, the severity is measured in a scale from 1 to 4, where 4 is the most serious, meaning a breach of the cockpit. So that's what the pilots now reported to the controller, together with a request to immediately divert to Portland and have law enforcement waiting for them when they arrived. But this ordeal was far from over, least of all for Joe. As he left the cockpit, he walked down the middle aisle and looked at all of the families sitting there, blissfully unaware of what had just happened in the cockpit. He thought about all the times that he had been traveling with his own family, and that started the feeling of this all being a bad dream to come creeping back again. But before he completely succumbed to it, he turned over and told the flight attendant, "You need to cuff me right now or this is going to be bad." The flight attendant did what she was told and cuffed his hands with some flex cuff that they had on board, but she did so with his hands in front of him so he could still move and use his hands a little bit. Remember, he was not aggressive at all, and this must have been a really confusing situation for the cabin crew, who had still not been briefed about what had just happened in the cockpit. As he was sitting down on the back crew jump seat, Joe soon grabbed a full jug of coffee from the machine and started drinking straight out of it, obviously still trying to make himself wake up from this dream, which was certainly not getting any better. The cabin crew handled this in a very professional manner. They took the pot of coffee away and then tried to talk to him and calm him down as the aircraft was now descending down towards Portland. The pilots made a PA to the passengers, explaining first that they had to divert dealing with an emergency, but then clarifying that it was a medical emergency, which in essence it actually was. During the descent, Joe kept asking the flight attendant if this was real or a nightmare. And he then took up his phone, sending off a text message to his friends explaining that he was having a mental breakdown and that he had tried to crash the aircraft. He also sent another one to his wife, which just said that he'd made a big mistake. At one point in the descent, he also reached over towards the emergency exit with the intent of trying to get it open so he could jump out. He thought that doing so would definitely wake him up, but the crew managed to stop him by gently removing his hands and continuing to engage him in conversation. Really impressive work. About 20 minutes after the incident started, the aircraft landed safely on runway 28 left in Portland, where they taxied into gate Bravo 7 and shut down their engines. As soon as the doors were opened, armed law enforcement entered the aircraft and escorted Joe out, with most of the passengers still not having any idea of the drama that had just unfolded. Even at this point, Joe was still not convinced that what he was experiencing was real, so he continued to ask the police whether it was or not. When the arresting officer confirmed that, yeah, it was, Joe responded that if this is real and all of that was real, then I have done something to me that is unfathomable. Joe was brought into custody, and it took until the following Wednesday, 5 days after he had eaten that mushroom, before he really started to come to his senses again. He is now facing 83 counts of attempted murder and reckless endangerment. There's no question that what he did was wrong, and I am in no way defending it, but Joe never meant to hurt anyone, as he was convinced that he was just dreaming, and he was clearly having a severe mental episode. The way I see it, this serves as a perfect example of what can happen when mental issues are not being treated at an early stage. Imagine a different scenario. One in which he immediately got in contact with a doctor when he felt the onset of early depression, and where the fear of losing his job because of it never entered his mind. Do you think that this would have happened then? In a statement, Joe has said that I'm horrified that those actions put myself and others at risk. He also added, the crew got dealt a situation there is no manual or checklist for, and they did an exemplary job keeping both me and the rest of the people on that plane safe. These quotes comes from an interview he did in jail, and they form part of an excellent New York Times article by Mike Baker, which I've linked to below. In that interview, Joe vowed to be as transparent as possible about what had happened, so that we can all learn from this terrible ordeal. He will likely never see the inside of a cockpit again, but in a very ironic twist, this incident and the way his honesty is highlighting the shortcomings in the aviation industry, this might well end up saving more lives than he ever endangered on that day. As an immediate result, the FAA announced that they are forming a pilot mental health committee with the explicit goal of finding ways to break down the barriers that prevents pilots from reporting mental health issues. And they also hope to use this group to help to improve pathways back into the cockpit after a pilot has suffered a mental health episode. Now, what we pilots need to do is to eventually trust that these regulatory actions are effective, start working with the system, and admit when we are not feeling well. We are not superhuman. We do get ill, just like everyone else, both in the body and the mind, and we need to remove the stigma that currently surrounds it. Now, the importance of monitoring and maintaining your mental health just cannot be overstated. And if you are working in a profession where it's hard to find time for quality mental health care, or you feel like your situation just doesn't allow it, well then let me tell you about today's sponsor, BetterHelp. BetterHelp takes away a lot of the traditional barriers to seeking therapy by making the access super simple. What you do is you just use my link here below, you fill in a short questionnaire, and then you'll be matched with a licensed mental health care professional within 48 hours, which you can then talk to directly from the comfort of your own home or wherever it feels convenient and safe. Now, I have used them myself to build up my self-confidence and work on productivity, and the fact that I could do so via video call made it super relaxed and convenient, but you can also reach them via messaging or phone calls. I know that taking that first step towards feeling better is often really hard, but BetterHelp was created exactly to help you with this. I've actually received emails from followers who have used the service and have praised the help that they have gotten. And if you want to do the same, just go to betterhelp.com/mentorpilot and get 10% off your first month. This could be the most important step that you've taken in a long time for both yourself and for those around you. Thank you BetterHelp for sponsoring this video, and remember that you can also support the work that we're doing here on the channel by joining my awesome Patreon crew or sending a super thanks with the $sign button here below. Have an absolutely fantastic day, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.